You're watching The Ready Writer, a show where I get to speak to writers of all different genres, mediums, and experiences. The Ready Writer. Are you ready? Hello and welcome to another episode of The Ready Writer. I am your host, Casey Bell, and today we have a returning guest, Randy Overbeck. Let's get this show started. All right, so welcome to this is The Ready Writer. You've been on a few of the shows, but I'll ask again for those who didn't see. Just start out with telling us when you first came into the knowledge of your joy of writing.
Sure. I've been a writer all my life. I spent the bulk of that life serving children as educators, as a teacher, college professor, and a school leader. But even in those jobs, I did a great deal of writing. And when I had a little more time on my hands, I went back to my first love from actually high school, and I began writing fiction again. I'd done a lot of nonfiction writing, of course, in my job. And I just kind of fell into it. And I really enjoyed being an educator, a teacher, an administrator. But I've found that I love writing and doing most of the things attached with being a writer and an author today. I enjoy them almost as much as I did serving children for nearly 40 years. So I'm glad to be where I am at this particular point, and I'm glad my readers are enjoying my books.
What was the first inspiration or the first spark that made you decide to start writing fiction, particularly?
It's really interesting because this book that's coming out next month, Cruel Lessons, is actually adapted from an original story that I wrote almost 30 years ago. It was actually the first time that I tried at that point in my life to put together a structure of what would eventually become a novel. I didn't know enough about it at that time, but I started that, and that impulse to do that had to do with the fact that I was dealing with a really traumatic time in my life at that point. I lost one of a couple different times I've lost a job, and I got squeezed out by somebody who was really ruthless and stuff. So creating a story with bad guys that were somewhat similar to the ones who were doing real things was originally therapy, and then therapy became writing, and that's where the inspiration came from. Now it's been sitting in the drawer for about 25 years, waiting for me to mature as a writer so that my skill would get to the level that I think could do it justice. And I'm glad that I had that. The story that people will read today, the skeleton of the story, the basic essence of the story is the same as what I invented back 20 some years ago, back in the 90s. But of course, the writing it's probably been revised and edited about a dozen times in that time. So I think I got it right, though.
Would you say that all of your fiction books are inspired by true events or people that you actually know, or are some of your books 100% fiction?
Well, none of the books are inspired by true events. So this particular book, Cruel Lessons, is a story of a rogue hallucinogenic drug, fictional drug, in the 90s that kids get a hold of and then end up getting killed in car crashes and stuff. So there is no such drug. I was concerned at that point, as I am today, with youth experimentation and drug abuse. So that part of the story is real, very real. I saw kids ruin their lives doing that. I knew children that I knew personally that died from a few overdose, but mainly doing like this, where they used the drug, went out and drove, and then went in a car crash. So in that sense, the stories are they are rooted in reality. All of the characters in almost all of my books are based on people that I knew. Now, I can give you two examples that they are actually taken from real people, but the rest of them are all composites. And the two that are taken are with their permission, of course. But the villain in here is a little bit like the person who was tormenting me in the 90s, but it's a little different. most characters have a composite. They might have the look of one teacher and the actions of another teacher, the third of the voice of a third one. But I use those to infuse some reality into the story. So people will say, I know a teacher like that. I know a teacher acted just like that. That's my goal.
In your writing, do you have a certain form of writing? Do you do outlines? Do you just start writing? Do you maybe, I know I've seen, well, I've seen in films someone talking into like one of those recorders before they get writing. Do you have a platform or a way you write and get yourself together in
Yes,
writing one of your books?
I do. It's kind of I kind of straddle halfway between a plotter, somebody who does the outline and creates the whole book, and somebody who's a pantser who just kind of writes by the seat of their pants. Usually, when I'm starting a new book, for example, in about a month and a half, I will start the fourth entry in the Haunted Shore Mysteries. By the time I start, I have done a considerable amount of research. In my case, I have to research a location. I have to research what kind of murder I want it to be and how that murder is tied to a larger social crime, social ill. I have to research how Daryl, my hero, is going to come into contact with that ghost in some kind of fairly realistic way. So all of those pieces have to kind of be thought through before I put the first pen to paper to actually start writing the story. I have all of my books have a great deal of research, so all of that precedes what I'm writing. And usually when I'm writing, I'll have an outline for maybe, well, no one else would recognize it as an outline. It's an outline to me for maybe a third of the book. And that'll get me started. And as I'm writing the first part of the book, the next part will appear and I'll sketch out phrases, snatches of dialogue, plot points. And then when I get to that, I'll write that out more fully and stuff. But here's the best example that I can show that I'm not really a full-fledged plotter. Many mystery writers, a number of ones I've talked to, actually start at the end. They start, who's the bad guy and how did they do it? And then they physically build their story from that. I don't do that at all. In each of my novels, I've actually purposely not decided who the ultimate bad guy is until I'm about 75% through the book. I have, 3 or 4 suspects that could be the ultimate villain. And I make sure that all of them I've laid track so that any of them they could be. But I purposely hold off until I get to that last 25% of the book to decide, I'm going to make it suspect C instead of A, B, or D. That's part of my inspirational, how did I get there kind of thing. Now, I'll be honest, when I'm done, I often have to go back in the book and make sure that I lay clues that, that led to this so that nobody's sitting there going, what? But it works for me.
I actually like that idea. Waiting till you get close to the end before making a final decision. So Cruel Lessons is out next month, October. Without any spoiler alerts, can you give us just a little bit more detail of the synopsis?
Yeah. As I mentioned, it's first of all, it's another story that I've set in the 90s. I happen to like that decade a lot, and it's and especially it's a very appropriate for my particular story, and I'll explain why. So, it's a story of a rogue hallucinogenic drug similar to LSD but more powerful that kids can apply on a tattoo that they put on their arm and it infuses into their bloodstream and gives them hallucinations. It's being pushed into a middle school. A bunch of kids get a hold of it, end up crashing a car. I'm not doing any spoilers. This all happens in the first chapter. The story is actually about the 2 educators involved, an elementary school teacher and a school administrator, who end up working with a member of the police to try to figure out who is pushing the drugs, poisoning the kids, and then eventually killing the kids. It's an amateur sleuth mystery. And the reason I chose that particular timeline for the story is because if people may not remember that, but at that point in the middle 90s, we were knee deep in this quote anti-drug program that wasn't worth a darn, called Just Say No. So I wanted to show how that across that background that it was having little or no effect on these kids who were experimenting with drugs. So that setting the story in that time, as well as in the anonymous Midwest small town, was my way of kind of using it as a metaphor for what's going on now. So when readers read that, my hope is that they will see the opioid crisis we have now, the heroin crisis that's going on now, and they'll see parallels between what kids are doing today and what I exposed in the 90s. But the story is really about the adults, because it's all about trying to figure out who in this spectrum of individuals are. Everybody in the story are all connected to education. So there's parents, and there are union presidents, and there are board members, and there are superintendents, and there are custodians and secretaries. So all the good guys and all the bad guys are involved, are part of the educational system. And part of the fun in the book, I hope, is for readers to try to see if they can figure out who's who.
Cool. So
the early reviews have been over the top. And then, like Bookhaven said, it's one of the best thrillers they've ever read. Reader's View called it one of the best mysteries of 2023. So I'm very excited to see when it releases next month, what kind of a response it gets.
And these reviews, I'm assuming they're on your website, correct?
Correct. They're in the book. These are advanced reviews. The publisher sent the book too early to get their response, and they are on the website. And speaking of which, I have a brand new website, or I should say a new refreshed website, which just came up today. It just opened on this date. I don't know when we're going to air this, but whenever they go on, they'll be able to see the new website with all the information on the new book, new reviews, new order forms, everything. I'm excited about it. I'm really, it looks fantastic.
And is the book, well, I know it's available in October. Are there pre-sales available? Did you mention that?
It's pre-order. It can be pre-ordered today, as of now,
Okay.
on most any of the platforms that people use. Not every platform, but it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble, it's on Kobo, it's on Apple Books. So most of the platform people are going to get books. They could pre-order it now, either ebook or print. And if they're so inclined, if they're interested in getting a print copy or a signed copy, they can contact me directly and I will ship one out to them.
Cool. So as you said, you mentioned a mixture of, I guess you can say, your past with dealing with someone, as well as you being a teacher and a professor. This was most of this inspiration, as well as you mentioned in the 90s, there was the DARE program. I believe it was drug awareness, resistance education, which I do remember learning about it. And I do remember, I'm going to say by the 8th, 9th grade, overhearing students having conversations of experimenting with drugs. So, and the county I live in now, in New Jersey, actually still has a heroin problem. When I first moved here back in 2005, I wasn't aware of it. When I was working in McDonald's, by then I knew it was like 2006 or 7 or 8. And that was when they first dealt with it, only because the parents of a child who died from it wrote in the newspaper, you know, when they write so-and-so died, they actually put in there, he died from a heroin overdose, and everyone was angry because they felt like that they didn't have done that. And they said, if we don't deal with it, it's going to keep going. And so they're still slowly dealing with it, but thankfully they're finally admitting that it's more than just a program. You got to talk about it. So I thank you for writing this book and bringing this out. What I guess you can say, what advice would you give to parents and even teachers on dealing with students and children on this matter?
Well, I think based on the people who know a whole lot more about this than I do, the number one key in all of this is communication. Parents cannot wait until their kid is a teenager or a preteen to have their first conversation about the danger of the experimentation. And things were tough when at the time I wrote the book. But the difference today is, if kids aren't careful, they could use one particular drug one time, and it could alter their brain chemistry forever. Just one use. In the 90s, that was unheard of. That kind of rampant change in your body and your mind system didn't exist. So parents need to have a really upfront conversation. There's a wonderful organization called the Natural High. That's a nonprofit, and they provide resources for teachers and parents to have that conversation. The resources are all free. There's no cost involved or anything. And they're involved in many high schools, but their headquarters is in California, even though all the resources are all online and they're available. But so their presence is much greater out west than it is in this part of the country. But I would recommend, one of my recommendations for parents is look up naturalhigh.org. Go to their website, start looking at they'll have conversation starters that you can have with kids. It's a very difficult. Parents told us repeatedly that it was more difficult to have conversation with their children about sex and about drugs than it was about dying, which tells you a lot about kind of where people's minds are. So, in your case, you're talking about a kid that died, which nowadays that's not that uncommon. Unfortunately, almost everyone knows somebody, at least in their outside circle, who died from a heroin overdose or a fentanyl overdose or something, or an opioid overdose, any one of those combinations. It's a very real issue. It's not going to go away.
No, that was actually a problem. Was it was too common. I spoke to some of the high school students who worked at McDonald's, and I just asked, how many of the people you went to school with, died? They said the same thing. I don't know. I stopped counting, and they all experienced that many. And that's why the parents decided to be brave enough to say, well, if no one else is going to talk about it, we are. And they now have an organization that helps with the issue. And so again, I thank you for bringing this book to us. What is the specific date again? October
11th is the launch date.
October 11th. All right. So October 11th,
yeah.
They can start reading it. Well, they can read it on the 11th if they are getting the ebook, obviously. And then if they're purchasing the print, they have to wait till it comes in the mail.
And I think even now they can read a sample of it up on, at least on some platforms, on Amazon. I know you can. Take a look at the chapter and then some. So I'm excited about the possibility. My goal is to entertain. I think they will have an enjoyable read, but by the time they're finished reading, they'll give them a little more insight into the struggle that in this case schools go through to try to stop this scourge from coming into their buildings.
And would you consider this appropriate? I guess you could say for high school students.
Oh yeah, there's no inappropriate language. There's very little violence involved in this book. There isn't anything. I don't think even the most prurient will not find it. Well, I don't think they would find it very uncomfortable in any case. And high school kids, I've already had some do some reading from before, and they enjoyed it very much. I would definitely recommend it for any high schooler at least. Maybe junior high, but definitely high schooler.
So you would say probably grade 8, 12,
Yeah.
13 and up?
Yeah, definitely. And that's the time when the kids, my story actually, the kids that are actually involved, and I did this on purpose, are actually 11-year-olds. So these are 11-year-olds experimenting. And I did that because where I was in school, we had kids that young experimenting with drugs, especially depending on what kind of environment they came from, that was common. So I wanted to make it shocking because those are the kids who are doing the experimenting and die in the very first chapter of the book. So again, the younger we can get this message to, the more likely it is to resonate.
Thank you. So definitely parents and teachers, if you're watching, hopefully you can first read it, and then if you see it appropriate for your students and children, to recommend it to them. We are now going to take a little detour and talk about, I'm not sure, are you still doing your podcast?
I am. In fact, my podcast just passed 1,000 listeners. Not this past month, but the month before. It's continuing to get new listeners every month, and I'm really thrilled about that. I have a podcast called Great Stories about Great Storytellers, and I take authors, directors, and poets that pretty much everybody is familiar with, but I tell them, I reveal the story, their backstory that hardly anyone knows about. So I've dealt with famous authors like J.K. Rowling and John Grisham, and some classical authors like Agatha Christie and Mark Twain, and I delve into their background and explain some interesting tidbits about their history and some things that make them the way they are. In fact, I will launch the next episode in great stories about great storytellers this week, about a great mystery writer we just lost this year by the name of Anne Perry. She's a British writer who's written in a remarkable over 100 titles, all of whom are just fantastic. Sold 26 million copies of her books. And all of them are historicals. So not only are they a great mystery, she writes historicals and places them in the middle 19th century, the late 19th century, the early 20th century. And then she wrote historicals about World War II. She's even got a couple of children's books that she's written. It was I knew some about Anne Perry. I didn't know a lot, but people listen to the podcast will learn a lot more. The podcast is it's a fun listen. It's about 10 to 15 minutes each episode. And I was fortunate enough to have you sponsor one of those, and I really appreciate that.
Yes, well, thank you for the inviting me to do that. What inspired you to start this podcast?
Well, I taught English literature, so I've always been an admirer of American and English writers. And what I found out in school was that when we would be talking about Edgar Allan Poe, for example, and kids would kind of tolerate their writing, but when I was able to make the writers come alive for them, be able to do the research into what the writer was really like and what kind of problems they faced and how they fell in love, any of those things, that's what my students enjoyed the most. So that got me thinking, going, I bet people would love to know, how did John Grisham become John Grisham? What were the factors that went into him becoming this remarkable best-selling author that everybody knows of? And Agatha Christie, did they know that Agatha Christie, there's a mystery about her that wasn't solved for 20 days. And Anne Perry, the one I'm talking about tonight, actually was convicted of murder before she became an author. So there's a whole lot of very interesting tidbits that people will enjoy about either author or a poet or a director. I've done Walt Disney, for example, and talked about the chances that Walt Disney took and how they worked out for him, and talk about Steven Spielberg. And then coming up next month, we're going to do Alfred Hitchcock. So the episodes are varied. I've deliberately tried to choose some very different kinds of people, storytellers, that I thought my listeners might enjoy. And so far, it seems to be hitting a responsive chord.
Well, now I shouldn't ask you this question, but I'm going to ask you anyways, even though your latest book is out, Cruel Lessons. Between all the books you've written so far, is there anyone you can say might be your favorite, or maybe you enjoyed the most in creating?
Well, I think the new one that's out is, from all my beta readers' advice, is the best book I've written so far. But I'll be honest, I have had the most fun it's also been the most challenging with the new project that I'm in the final stretch on. Let's put it that way. It's a very big departure from what I've done before. It's not a mystery. It's not a thriller. It's a historical suspense about the Culper Ring. Now, in case you don't know, the Culper Ring was the organization, this very small organization of spies that George Washington had report to him, and the spies are the ones who actually helped win the Revolutionary War. And when I've always been fascinated by them, but when I did research on them, excuse me, I learned that this ring consisted of 6 men and 1 woman. Each of the 6 men have been identified, although the last member of the ring, male member of the ring, was not identified until the 1920s. That's how secret this organization was. And the woman has never been identified. There have been 2 historical guesses, but nobody knows. So I took that as an opening, and I created a fictional character who is, of course, a teacher in those days, a tutor, and she becomes the female member of the spy ring. And it's her story of how she went from loyal British subject coming over to America to become a member of the spy ring. It took a massive amount of research to get the historical details right, but I enjoy doing that, and it's probably the story I have had the most fun writing.
Well, since you mentioned it, give us your insight on the pros and cons of having beta readers, and would you suggest it for all authors to have them?
You know, my short answer is yes, I would suggest it. They have been. I have two rings of support that I have found absolutely essential to helping me produce the best product I could. I use my beta readers very differently than some others. So I have about it fluctuates by book, but about 10 to 12 beta readers who will agree to read the book, who will agree to read the manuscript as it's being developed. What I do is I send them the manuscript in thirds. So they get the first third of the book when I am that far through with the book. And when they get those pages, they have a list of questions they have to respond to. How did I do this? Was there a place where this didn't work? How did you relate to this character? Did you see any places where things are out of place? Stuff like that. And then I do the same thing for this. Then when I'm 2/3 of the way through the book, they'll get the first and second third, and then with a similar fashion. And then and the last one, then they'll finally get the entire book. I have found their feedback to be absolutely essential. Many of my POVs are female. Obviously, in this new story I just told you about, the primary POV is female. Oh, there's a male POV as well. In Cruel Lessons, there are 2 primary POVs, the male administrator and the female teacher. And one of the things I rely on my beta readers, none of whom are writers, incidentally, they're only readers who are reading the book and responding. I ask them if they think I'm getting that voice right. Does that sound like what a woman would say? And they are very fortunate that they are very candid with me, very honest. They're not afraid to say, you went off the track here. And I can't tell you how many times that has corrected me. And the reason I do it in the thirds is I will often ask something about the future part of the book, and their answers will help guide me. Well, I need to go in this direction. And then in addition to that, I also belong to a writers group who give me a response that's a very different response. And they're actually looking at parts of the book chapter by chapter and critiquing it and giving me suggestions on that, which is not something I ask the beta readers to do at all. Neither one of them are editors. So nobody's out there saying, well, correct this. That's not their role at all. But I have found it really, really valuable to be able to have multiple perspectives on how this passage or how this section or how the whole manuscript is working. And as long as you're comfortable as an author being willing to take criticism and encourage your people to do that, I think it's really valuable. if your beta reader is only going to read it and go, oh, I loved it, it was wonderful, I tell them that doesn't help me a bit. I appreciate that, but you need to tell me, was there any place that it went off? Did you find a place that was hard to read? Was there a place where I had too much description? So, and those are the kind of feedbacks that I get from my beta readers. Some are more critical than others, but everybody usually will give me some feedback that will help me make the manuscript stronger.
Cool. So 2 more questions for you. First one, what is a POV?
Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't be talking language. POV is a point of view character.
Okay.
So in almost, well, no, there are a few stories where that's the story's not told to that, but the vast majority of stories any reader will read will have somebody through whom the story is told.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a first person POV, meaning I did this, I did that. Walt Longmire's books or stories are like that, and they are fantastic. But more often they're called what's called deep third person, which is he said, she said, they did this. In all of the books that I have, except for my very first book, the 3 Haunted Shore Mysteries, this new one, Cruel Lessons, and then the new project that I'm working on are all deep third person. So you're seeing that why that's really important is that you can only see what the reader can only see what that character can see. Or we can only learn the part of the story that that character knows. That's the idea behind a POV.
All right. And last question, is there an author out there, whether they be dead or alive, you would have liked to or would like to have lunch with, have a conversation, maybe discuss a book that they wrote that you had questions about?
Well, I've been very fortunate to count among my friends several best-selling authors who have been very generous with both their advice and their support. And the times that I get to talk with them, I'm really, really thrilled about that. I would love to have more time, like, let's spend a day together and let's talk about writing with somebody like William Kent Kruger. Now, William Kent Kruger is a best-selling mystery writer who lives in northern Minnesota and writes about northern Minnesota and makes the place absolutely memorable. He has 19 in the series called Corcoran O'Connor series, which is his POV character. And he also has several other books. Some of the books have won him the Edgar, which is the highest mystery award that you can get. I'd love to have some time to talk with him. Hank Philippi Ryan is another wonderful author that I've had some time with, but she, even when we only have 5 minutes, she will give me insight into my books that I really hadn't had before. So if I had a day with her or spend coffee with her, it would be really valuable. I met all of these authors at writing conferences. And one of the things I recommend to new writers, you've not done this, you need to get yourself to a writing conference that's somewhere close to where you live. Because you will find that these superstars, these writing superstars, I have found almost to a person, there's one exception, but almost to a person are considerate, generous, supportive of other writers, will be willing to give you advice, all those kinds of things.
All right.
Ken Follett, I'm sorry, I got to mention Ken Follett. I have become a big historical fiction lover, and nobody does it better than him. When I'm writing the book I told you about, boy, if I could have a day with him. So if people don't know him, he's the one that wrote the Pillars of the Earth trilogy. It's the largest, the biggest selling historical fiction book in history. It's the story of a building of a medieval cathedral, which you would think would not be very interesting, and he makes it absolutely fascinating. I would love to get insights from him from across the pond. He's a British writer for my newest project. If I had an hour with him, I'm sure my project would be way better.
Well, that is all the time we have for you today on Ready Writer. I want to thank our guest, Randy Overbeck, for sharing. And of course, thank you so much, audience, for taking the time to watch. Have a great day. See you again.